Bonjour tout le monde, merci. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. Et comme Karen, je vais parler en anglais. C'est plus facile pour moi et aussi les mots de le cœur. Okay. So I'm not going to talk so much about the results of research about life habits, but what I wanted to take a few minutes is to explain to people what epidemiologists do. It's a long word, and it's not about skin, not about the epidermis. So I'm going to give a little bit of a session to you about what epidemiologists do and how they study life habits and MS, and why it's important to do so. So I have a few slides that you might not expect to see in such a presentation, but hopefully this will be interesting for you. I do want to say that I started doing multiple sclerosis research in 1978 as a student, and I began my research because my best friend developed multiple sclerosis, and I felt as a graduate student learning research methods, there must be something that I could study in multiple sclerosis, and I can honestly say there have been remarkable changes and progress over that time frame, but we still have lots to do. Okay, so what do I mean about life habits? This is my outline. What does an epidemiologist do? How do epidemiologists study risk factors? And I will talk a little bit about another large study that I'm involved in, and also just to summarize at the end. So what are life habits? They're really acquired patterns of behavior, and why they are of interest to epidemiologists is theoretically, one can imagine that if we were able to establish a very clear link, we could modify these habits before the onset of disease and perhaps go one step further in identifying the cause, but being able to prevent the disease. The other aspect is if we can show these factors are associated, we can take this information to the laboratory scientists and say, how is it possible, for instance, that smoking may be a contributing factor to multiple sclerosis? And that can help them perhaps evaluate at the cellular level what's happening and perhaps even develop treatments. So the ones that I'm going to talk about, because really these are the ones that are in the study, are smoking, aspects of diet, alcohol consumption, and sun exposure. So what do? We look at the distribution, or if you like, the pattern of health-related states and events, diseases, and populations. So one of the simplest things that epidemiologists do is actually look at maps of countries and look at the frequency of diseases across different countries. And multiple sclerosis is one disease that has quite a unique geographic distribution. It has a different frequency in different countries. And I think that leads people to say, then there must be something in the environment. If the disease is very rare, for instance, in South Africa, but common in Canada, then is it something to do with the environment? And a lot of people immediately say, is it the sun? Is it the weather? So that kind of information, those kind of clues, epidemiologists take and then try to drill down and study. So we conduct studies to identify patterns with the goal of identifying the cause. And for the most part, we're not looking at the cellular level. We actually interact with what I call an intact human being. We ask people information about themselves. So we do a lot of work with interviews and questionnaires to get information from people. And we study patterns in space, as I mentioned. We also look at patterns in time. If there's been a change in the frequency of a disease over time, what does that mean? How could that happen? And also looking at different groups. So I'm going to give this is a little bit of a teaching session. This is some information that I give to my graduate students when I teach. I want to talk about a gentleman called John Snow, a physician in the UK in the 1800s. He lived in an area of London where there was a cholera epidemic. And no one knew what the cause of cholera was at that point. There were a lot of people felt that it was just something in the air, and some people breathed it in and they got cholera. He had a different idea. He thought that cholera was passed through the water. And one of the reasons he thought that is when he went to different areas of London where there were a lot of cases of cholera, he actually said the water smelt differently. So he used that as sort of an observation to then conduct a study. And this is his original map. I think I have a pointer here, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. There, okay. I don't know how I can point. Never mind, you can see. In the middle, there's a little circle and there's an arrow. And that's where there was a water pump. And all the little dots around, the small dots, indicate cases of cholera. And the other circles are other water pumps that come from other water companies. So again, using observation, he identified this single source of water, at least he thought, this is the source of water that must be responsible for these cases of cholera. So he didn't do any detailed experiments, it was observational. And what he did is he removed the handle of the pump. And there were no more cases of cholera in that area. So, sorry, here's an example where through observation and looking at association, he didn't really know that that was the cause, but it seemed like it should be given his observations. He didn't know, the only option he had, he couldn't treat anything, the only option he had was to remove the source. And it was only 25 years later that scientists actually identified cholera and the way it was transmitted. So that's, we call him sort of the probably great-great-grandfather of epidemiology, because that was a clear observational study. Now, if things were that easy, we would know the cause of a lot of chronic diseases, but we don't. But this is just an example of what an epidemiologist does. But how do we study risk factors? We don't do that. There are no pumps that we can take the handles off anymore. So as I said, our goal is to identify a cause of a disease, and ideally, if we were to remove the cause, then the disease would not occur. But for many non-infectious diseases, it's unlikely that there's a single cause. For cholera, we know there's a single cause now. But for a disease like multiple sclerosis, it's very unlikely that there's one cause. If there was one cause, a life habit, for instance, we would have found it by now because it would have been clear. The signal would have been very clear. Most diseases are what we call multifactorial. That means there are probably several different factors that act together to cause the disease process to begin. So I'm taking the liberty, with all due respect to the author of this book, to illustrate the concept of multiple causes and how it's very difficult to study them. And I'm using a children's book, and I'm not meaning to be facetious at all, because I know this is an incredibly serious subject, but I think as an example to illustrate this, I think it works. By the way, it's a wonderful book for those of you who have kids, and I bought it for my granddaughter, and it's available in multiple languages. And it's called Who Sank the Boat? And the idea behind it is there are a number of animals who are all friends, and they decide to go out on a boat together. And as they get into the boat gets lower and lower in the water, and suddenly it sinks. And the question is, who sank the boat of all of the animals in the boat? So here's the classic example. Here are all the very heavy animals in the boat. The boat is low in the water, but it's actually the little tiny mouse, the last one who jumps in the boat, is responsible for sinking the boat. And this is sort of an illustration of how multiple causes act together. Not any one of them is sufficient to cause the disease. You need, and maybe not even any one of them is necessary. You need just that right combination, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in a specific order, right? So that's the sort of illustrating the concept of multiple causes. So how is this relevant for MS in what we think we know? So if you look at this figure, on the left-hand side we have birth, and then sometime before the onset, the disease onset of multiple sclerosis, we have what we could call a disease induction period, and that's where these various component causes contribute to the causal process. And then later on, as we know, a little bit after onset, there will be diagnosis. As an epidemiologist, I'm particularly interested in that time before onset and trying to disentangle these causes. But we have a lot of questions. And I've alluded to this before, is a specific order needed? Do they have to be in a particular order, or can they go in any order? Can there be an early cause? Does it have to be early, followed by cause number 2 and cause number 3? We don't know the answer to that. Do you need all of them in order to develop multiple sclerosis or any other disease? Or can there be a subset, and for some people, could that be enough? And can we modify any of them? Some of them are not modifiable. We know that multiple sclerosis is more common in women. We can't modify that. So if you like, that could be one of the components. It already puts women at slightly higher risk, but what else needs to be added? It isn't sufficient, because that would mean all women would have multiple sclerosis if it was sufficient. And it's not necessary, because men, as we know, also develop MS. So it's complicated. The most common type of study that we use in epidemiology is called a case control study. Basically, what we do is we compare people living with multiple sclerosis to people who are not living with multiple sclerosis. And we ask them a lot of questions, and sometimes we do evaluations on them, and we look at factors that were present or that they recall having experienced well before the onset of the disease. And the hypothesis is if we find that people with MS report these factors differently than people without, then these life habits may be important risk factors for MS. That's not the end of the story. It doesn't mean they're causes, but it could give clues to what we should look at in more detail in the lab. So I said I would talk about a large study that I'm leading now, and I wouldn't be very surprised if there were people in this room who had received my questionnaire, since it is a large study. This is a study done in 5 countries, and we wanted to look at risk factors for MS. The reason we chose these countries, and I mentioned before about the geographic distribution, is because the frequency of multiple sclerosis is slightly different in those countries, and the frequency of the life habits, things like smoking, for instance, and sun exposure, is also different. So we thought it could be very informative to do the same exact study in 5 different countries so that we could compare the types of results that we got. So we used the same questionnaire in each country. The translation activities were very interesting because it was a lot of work to do that. And all participants filled out a 6 to 8 page questionnaire, which we sent to them by mail. So there was work on the side of the participants as well. In the questionnaire, we asked basic demographic information. We asked residential history. We asked people about their educational level and their occupation. We also asked them to try and remember for us the level of sun exposure they'd had essentially from birth to age 30. And this is not an easy thing to remember. So we had some questions on that. We asked people about diet. We had a large section about different types of food that people ate at different ages as far as they could remember. We asked them about diseases that they had experienced when they were young. We asked them about their smoking history. We asked them about their parents' smoking history. That was. We asked them about physical activity. We asked them to remember their body size over this time period from birth to age 30, and I have a figure that shows you how we did that. We also asked about reproductive history, a number of pregnancies, et cetera. So it was a lot of information over a long time frame, but it was a way of digging to try and get this information. We enrolled nearly 7,500 participants. So the study took place in Canada, Norway, Italy, Sweden, and Serbia. And here I've listed here, for instance, in Canada, and 2/3 of the participants in the Canadian study were from Montreal. So we had 1,820 participants from Canada, of whom almost half were individuals with multiple sclerosis. So you can see this is actually the largest study of this type that's ever been conducted. This is the brochure. This was all done by mail. We contacted people by phone and asked them if they would receive a questionnaire from us. We sent them the questionnaire, they sent it back to us, and we did not record their name after we had contacted them. So we're not going back to participants, it was completely anonymous. So you'll see here we have our logo with all the different flags of the countries, and this is a study that was funded by the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada. It was also funded by the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Italy, the MS Society of Norway, and of Sweden. Serbia doesn't have funding agencies, so we were able to provide some funding to them. This is an example, and it's very challenging to figure out how you can ask questions of people and ask them to remember over the last 30 years. This is actually a validated questionnaire where you show people body images at different sizes, obviously, from the lowest to the highest, and you ask them at various ages to recall what their body image was at that time. And that's actually been validated against weights. Believe it or not, this is one of the very largest studies in MS that's been done. The Nurses' Health Study in the US uses these silhouettes. We use these in our study, and there is a separate validated silhouette for men as well. And it actually does correlate very well with weight, surprisingly. So what we've done, we're not finished the analyses. There's a lot of information we have. We've started doing the analyses, and the first thing we're doing is we're looking at the factors one by one, because what we want to know is whether we're getting the same results as other studies have done. And indeed we are. We've looked at smoking, and we found that amongst the people with multiple sclerosis, they are more likely to report having smoked before onset. That's a consistent finding, and we've actually found that in every country, no matter what the prevalence of smoking. We're starting to look at infectious diseases in childhood, and that's where we differ a little bit across the countries, because in Italy, particularly Sardinia, where most of the study took place, the childhood infectious diseases are different than ones we experience in Canada. For instance, there are a lot of parasitic infections in Sardinia, so we're teasing out the differences there. Sun exposure. We have found, and again, just looking at one thing at a time, we have found that lower reported levels of sun exposure seems to be associated with MS. We've looked at breastfeeding. We actually have just finished an analysis looking at breastfeeding. And again, on its own, not looking at the other things at the same time. And we have our preliminary findings found that longer breastfeeding, and we define longer as greater than 4 months, seems to protect against multiple sclerosis. One single observation doesn't mean that it's a cause, but it's intriguing, because here you can immediately see the first factors I mentioned increase the risk, and here's one that seems to reduce the risk. So we have to be careful when we put them together. How do they balance out? We've looked at socioeconomic status. Those analyses are ongoing. We've looked at the parents' education, and we've looked at the participants' education. I should also note that one of the things we encourage the participants of the study to do is to speak to their parents, if that was possible, to get some of this information from them. And we've also asked them if they did, so we can look at those people who had parental input to see whether the results are the same. What we're doing now is we're starting to look at these factors all together in different orders at different ages. So going back to the book, trying to figure out who sank the boat. Is there a particular pattern? Can we find a pattern of these risk factors within this very large study? What's been interesting for us is because we developed a questionnaire, we started off with it in English, and then we translated it into Serbian, Sweden, Norwegian, Italian, and French Canadian. We've had a lot of interest around the world to use our questionnaire and adapt the questionnaire. This is very exciting because what it will mean is that if other countries do the same study as we do, then we'll have a lot more information around the world. So far, we've already developed a Spanish version. It has to be adapted for Cuban Spanish and Mexican Spanish. We've had strong interest from a group in Portugal who want to repeat our study, certainly in France and also in Russia. So it's very exciting to see that a study that actually started in Quebec, in fact, I was the lead PI at the beginning, has now become an international opportunity. So what's my message here? My message is there are likely many risk factors that have to be present in order to initiate the disease process in multiple sclerosis. And I'm going to say that the last risk factor that begins the process is not yet known. We don't know what the last one is, and it might not be the same last one for everyone, which makes the challenge of studying it a little bit more difficult. In order to do it, you need really large studies. And when you do really large studies, you have to engage the interest of a large number of people. And any of you in the room who've participated in research studies, I thank you as a researcher, because we cannot do research without the altruism of individuals like yourselves who participate. So thank you very much. The research community is working hard. And I began in the late 70s. The pace has not slowed, and in fact, I think it's much faster now. As Karen has already said, there's a great push from the MS community and a large number of students who have now selected MS research for their career. So in order to find the pieces of the puzzle, what we want that to do is to help us identify factors that could be modified and prevent MS. That's for sure. I mean, that would be a wonderful finding. But not only that, if we can't get to the point of preventing, I think the research that's done in epidemiology, this type of research does, I say it does serve to guide research into understanding how the process itself begins, and why a particular factor could initiate a disease process. And that ultimately, if we understand the process, can certainly lead to the development of additional effective treatments and also effective treatments for progressive MS. So with that, I thank you, and I think I've left enough time for some questions. Thank you.